By now, I'm sure you've all heard about the new iPhone 14. And it's basically identical to the iPhone 13, even including the internal chip. One thing that Apple should get credit for is keeping the prices the same, at least for American customers, despite the record high inflation. The same, however, cannot be said about European customers who experienced price hikes across the board. Take the iPhone 14 Pro Max for example. In the US, this phone comes in at $1,100. But in the UK, this phone comes in at £1,200, and in Germany, this phone comes in at €1,450. This translates to $1,385 in the UK and an eye-watering $1,450 in Germany. It wasn't just the Pro series that saw these price bumps either. All the standard iPhone models went up by £70 or €100. This means that the average European will need to spend 30% more than an American to get the same product. Most people have written this off as pure greed from Apple. If Apple had risen prices in the US, the media would have shredded them. But by only increasing prices in Europe, they've been able to substantially reduce the backlash. This argument definitely has a lot of merit to it, given that Apple didn't exactly need to raise prices given their healthy profit margins. But with that being said, there is also a legitimate reason for raising prices only in Europe. To put it bluntly, European currencies are currently performing a cliff dive maneuver in comparison to the US dollar. The conversion rate from euros to dollars is at 20-year lows, and this isn't some new phenomenon either. In fact, the euro has been consistently losing dominance to the dollar since mid-2008, when you could get $1.60 using just €1. Today, however, you can barely get a single dollar with a single euro. A similar story can be seen with the pound as well. The pound is currently at a 37-year low against the dollar and has been on a consistent decline since late 2007. At the peak, you could get over $2 with a single pound, but today you can only get $1.15 with a single pound. When you consider these shifts in currency values, Apple's price hikes, while still insane, make a little bit more sense. But this brings up the question, why in the world are European currencies doing so bad? Taking a look back, this is clearly not a new trend. This downtrend has been forming for well over a decade, and the recent issues have simply worsened the situation. So, what set off this chain of events? Well, one of the biggest fundamental issues plaguing the euro since its creation is the fact that it's not just representative of one country. Initially, this was seen as a benefit. The euro promised to unify European countries economically and to make trade between these neighboring countries easier than ever before. This unification also promised to make Europe as a whole a stronger economic force against the US. But the problem with the unified currency is that it's virtually impossible to set economic policies that are appropriate for every member. You see, with America, while the various states have differences culturally and politically, they're extremely homogeneous economically. When Californian businesses are suffering from a bear market, so are Texan businesses. Similarly, when New York businesses are booming, it's more likely that Floridian businesses are also booming. So it makes sense for all these states to use the same currency and for the Fed to set overarching economic policies. The same, however, cannot be said about the members of the Eurozone, and especially the poorly performing members. Over the past 15 years, this has primarily been Spain and Greece. Greece basically got wiped out by the 2008 financial crisis. If the EU didn't bail them out, Greece would have defaulted on their debt and spiraled into a depression. During the worst of it, Greece's budget deficit was equivalent to 12.9% of their GDP. For perspective, that would be equivalent to the US having a budget deficit of $2.7 trillion per year. At first, Greece tried to play it cool and assured everyone that they would get their debt in check within 2 years. But just 4 months later, Greece would admit that they could default at any moment. Around the same time, Spain was going through their own economic crisis. Like Greece, Spain's economy was devastated by the 2008 financial recession, and they were spiraling into a depression. As an outside observer, Americans could feel bad for these countries and their people, but economically speaking, they weren't all that affected. The same, however, could not be said about Eurozone countries who had skin in the game. Greece and Spain were already massive dead weights bringing down the euro. But if these countries collapsed, oh boy, it would be bad. So the prosperous Eurozone countries had no choice but to bail out these failing economies. The EU and the IMF would provide 240 billion euros worth of emergency funds to Greece and a 100 billion euro rescue package to Spain. And where do you think all this money came from? It of course came from quantitative easing, also known as money printing. Since 2008, the euro money supply has literally doubled. To make things worse, the bailouts weren't all that impactful either. Sure, they helped these countries stay afloat and not default. But fundamentally, they didn't change anything, and the underlying economies would just continue to get worse. While Spain and Greece were undergoing economic hell, many EU countries like the UK and Germany were actually recovering extraordinarily well. Their unemployment graphs were plummeting and their need for money printing was dwindling. However, they couldn't stop the money printing because certain Eurozone countries like Spain and Greece were still very much feeling the pain. In both Spain and Greece, unemployment would rocket to 25 to 30%. For perspective, unemployment didn't cross 25% even during the worst of the Great Depression. So these countries were no longer just experiencing a financial crisis. They were in a full-fledged economic depression, and this was painfully evident in their GDP numbers. Spain's GDP would fall from a peak of $1.6 trillion to just under $1.2 trillion. Similarly, Greece's GDP would fall from a peak of $354 billion to $192 billion. Even today, neither of these countries have been able to return to their peak GDPs. And this becomes even worse when you consider that Europe has been experiencing record inflation, meaning that their inflation-adjusted GDPs are even worse. Also, while I've mainly been picking on Greece and Spain throughout this video, these guys were by no means the only perpetrators, though they were the worst. Some of the other countries dragging down the euro included Cyprus, Portugal, Italy, Slovakia, and even France. This left the ECB in an extremely difficult situation. What were they supposed to do? On one side, they have countries like the UK, Germany, and Denmark, where unemployment was reaching historically low levels. These countries indicated that it was time to chill out on the money printing and potentially even start quantitative tightening. However, on the other end of the spectrum, you had the perpetrators who were in a more dire state than ever. These countries indicated that it might even be time to pump up the money printing. The ECB would end up siding with the countries that needed help, and they would keep economic policies loose. While this was probably a godsend for the struggling countries, the prosperous countries weren't exactly happy, and rightfully so. The prosperous countries didn't really benefit all that much from the loose economic policies, but they were very much harmed by its accompanying side effects. They were starting to feel that they brought significantly more to the table than they were receiving, and this feeling is what would eventually evolve into Brexit. In June of 2016, Britain would vote on leaving the EU, and after years of negotiations and discussions, Brexit would finally take place on January 31st, 2020. Much of England felt that they had finally gotten a fresh start and that they were no longer weighed down by the EU. But little did they know, the pandemic was just around the corner. Starting off with the most obvious economic side effect of the pandemic, we have the money printing. People often like to criticize the US for their excessive money printing, as they should. But what people often forget is that the whole world has been printing just as much money, if not even more. Take the UK for example, who has printed 895 billion pounds. At the average conversion rate over the past 2 years, this is equivalent to $1.14 trillion. Now, the US has grown its money supply by a far larger amount, coming in at roughly $6.2 trillion. But you have to look at it in relative terms. Compared to the American GDP of $21 trillion, American printing works out to roughly 30% of their GDP. Compared to the English GDP of $2.7 trillion, however, English printing works out to 42% of their GDP. That's clearly a problem. The ECB, on the other hand, hasn't been nearly as aggressive with their money printing, but they've been much more lenient when it comes to interest rates. The ECB literally maintained a negative interest rate into 2022, and they're just now starting to aggressively hike rates. All of that extra relative printing from the UK and the loose economic policies from the ECB have to be reflected somewhere, and that somewhere seems to be conversion rates. Economic policies aren't the only battle that Europe has been fighting though. They've also been hit hard by Russian sanctions. You see, Europe has historically been extremely dependent on Russia for oil and natural gas. Given the Russian sanctions, Europe has been forced to find new energy partners, which has been anything but easy. The problem is that the entire world knows that Europe is desperate for energy, which means that sellers can charge a premium, and that's exactly what they've been doing. Gas prices across the notable European countries are well above $5 per gallon, if not over $6 per gallon. A similar story can be seen with electricity prices as well. Meanwhile, Russia is simply adding fuel to the fire by essentially retaliating against the sanctions. You see, Europe has yet to fully cut off Russia. They still receive a significant amount of crude oil through pipelines like the Nord Stream 1. This specific pipeline was closed in July for 10 days for regular maintenance. But when the pipeline was reopened, it was only operating at 20% capacity. Russia would close down the pipeline again at the end of August, citing an apparent leak. And Russia has yet to reopen this pipeline as of September 8th. While Russia would like to convince us that there's a leak, it seems like Russia is simply halting oil flow on purpose to spike energy prices in Europe. As Europeans are forced to spend more on energy, they're naturally going to pull back on discretionary spending. And given that the central banks are also starting to pull back, this sets up the perfect storm for an economic disaster. At the end of the day, the euro was created with good intentions. It aimed to unify Europe economically and create a global powerhouse. However, a major shortfall of the system is the vast inequality between the member countries. This has forced the prosperous countries to constantly prop up the failing countries, which hasn't been particularly helpful for either of them. The UK has decided to take this issue into their own hands and become the first country to leave the EU. But this hasn't worked out all that well either. The pandemic, along with the Russian sanctions, have taken a massive toll on all European countries, and most of them are simply fighting to put off a nasty recession and bring down inflation. Compared to this, the US is actually doing really well. We've been ahead of the curve when it comes to economic tightening, and the recession isn't that bad, at least not yet. So naturally, the US dollar has been destroying European currencies, and by the looks of it, that's not going to be changing anytime soon. So Europe better get used to those iPhone price hikes because they're likely permanent. But that's just what I think. What do you think about European iPhone price hikes? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you hope that Europe can turn things around. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.